like this third passage. You know, we've got a real clear sense of purpose. You turn to somebody after just having read that and say, well, I just read something about how the previous version of equipoise is like so impossible that we should be using a new version that's just kind of a consensus. So that previous version, what the author called theoretical equipoise, that would be where you say that the conditions are exactly the same. You know, for all we know, medicine A is exactly as good as medicine B. And of course that's ridiculous. How could you possibly say that it's exactly as good, that all the data are perfectly balanced? Instead, she says, let's use this clinical equipoise where we don't have to maintain that there's an absolute perfection of balance. We can say, I think I like medicine A better, but I have some colleagues who like medicine B better, and I can understand that reasonable people can disagree, so I won't be beholden to the idea that A is the right one. At the same time, I won't be beholden to this false ideal of needing a perfect balance between A and B in order to do a study of medicine B. With that in mind, let's take a look at why these answers are the right answers. For 14, what's the author's primary purpose? Oh, it's to make that argument we just talked about in favor of a clinical equipoise over that theoretical equipoise. With clinical equipoise is certainly a more reasonable, less restrictive interpretation of an ethical requirement. For 15, the purpose of the second paragraph. When a paragraph starts with the word unfortunately, it's a pretty good tip that we are going to start listing some drawbacks, right? And of course, how do we know that D is the right answer? Well, when we leave that paragraph, do we know what the main difficulty is with adhering to the standards of theoretical equipoise? Yes, it's fucking impossible. As the author says at the beginning, it exists only when the overall evidence is exactly balanced. And this is an ideal hardly attainable in practice. And then goes on to explain why. 16, well, which of the following is true? And just go back to the passage and fetch what the passage said. And in line 51, one or more of a comparative clinical trials researchers may have a decided treatment preference, but that is no ethical bar to participation in the trial. A clinical trial comparing treatments is not rendered unethical merely because one of the physicians has come to favor one of the treatments. She said it. That's how we know it's the right answer. 17. So, okay, if you had two treatments that are being compared, and then you wanted to know a situation that would make it harder for theoretical equipoise, that wouldn't necessarily make it harder for the clinical equipoise, what would that look like? Well, again, you go back to the passage. What makes it hard for theoretical equipoise? When there's even the slightest accretion toward one side or the other. In fact, she says specifically in line 22, clinical researchers. This is an ideal that's hardly attainable in practice. Why? Because clinical researchers commonly have some preference for one of the treatments being tested. An intuitive preference, perhaps. So, having your involved researchers with a preference is damaging to the theoretical equipoise. However, line 49, the very absence of consensus is what makes clinical equipoise possible. So a lack of consensus is very damaging to the theoretical, and it is at the same time precisely what enables the clinical. And that's how we know that D is right, because the author talks about that in the passage. 18, oh my god, I've never seen this before. I literally have no memory of ever seeing this before. I don't think it's ever happened before. A main point question that was not the first question in the passage. Alright, I don't know what that means. It probably doesn't mean anything, but What is the main point of the passage? We talked about this when we were talking about the author's primary purpose, and you know that those two answer choices have to walk hand in hand. If the primary purpose is to argue for a more reasonable, less restrictive interpretation, then the main point is to make the argument for clinical equipoise over theoretical equipoise. And it's exactly what D says. Number 19. How does the author use the word community to refer to a charming show that was on NBC and is now being moved for a 6th season to Yahoo? No. In line 39, one reason for conducting comparative clinical trials is to resolve a current or imminent conflict in the expert clinical community. So, a community is some group of people for whom a conflict may exist and who can resolve that conflict by appealing to a clinical trial. A group of people who focus on a common set of problems using a shared body of knowledge, the clinical trial. That's what the author says, so that's why we know that A is right. For question 20, what's true? What does the author say? Where does the author say in answer choice C that theoretical equipoise imposes a standard that's rarely, if ever, met? She says it in lines 20 and 21. Theoretical equipoise in line 20 requires exact balance, which is an ideal hardly attainable in practice. That leaves with just question 21. And how does answer choice A weaken the argument? Well, the argument was we can all just get along, right? That medical experts can just recognize in line 46 that opposing experts can differ honestly. In line 55, the researchers just recognize their less favored treatment is somebody else's more favored treatment. That's no problem. That's no problem unless you tell me that A is true. Unless the whole point of the whole deal is to find definitive proof that one treatment is in fact superior. Because if that's the case, then you don't get experts just recognizing that opposing experts can differ. You don't get researchers just recognizing that the one they like less is the favored one from somebody else. None of that will work if answer choice A is true. It defeats it utterly. In the same sort of way that we just defeated utterly this passage.